Chapter 1. Rust and Beginnings. The first time Wyatt Sanders laid eyes on the old man, he wasn't impressed. The shop was a small, weathered building tucked behind an old gas station, with a single roll-up door and a flickering neon sign that read, Harlan's Custom Fabrication. It wasn't much to look at, but Wyatt knew the name. Everyone in the local car scene did. Harlan Tate was a legend, one of those old-school builders who could turn a rusted-out shell into a showstopper. Wyatt had spent the last year hacking together his dream truck, a 1956 Chevy pickup he'd picked up as a rolling chassis. He had the eye for design, the passion, and a growing reputation on social media. What he didn't have, he was starting to realize, was the experience to get it structurally right. That's why the truck was here. "You're Wyatt, right?" Harlan asked, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag as he stepped out from behind a stripped-down '32 Ford Coupe. He was in his 60s, his hair more silver than black, with a beard that looked like steel wool. His eyes were sharp, though, not the kind that missed much. "Yeah," Wyatt said, shoving his hands in his pockets. "Brought my truck." Harlan took a slow walk around the Chevy, his calloused fingers tracing the edges of the metalwork. He crouched, ran a hand under the frame, and let out a quiet grunt. "You do this bracing yourself?" Wyatt nodded, bracing for what was coming. Harlan sighed, standing up with a creak in his knees. "You ever hear the phrase, measure twice, cut once?" Wyatt crossed his arms. "Yeah. Why?" "'Cause it don't look like you did either." Wyatt's jaw clenched. He expected criticism, but not like this. "Look, I ain't some hack. I put a lot of work into this." "I'm not saying you didn't," Harlan replied. "I'm saying some of it ain't gonna hold up once you put real weight on it. That cross member? Gonna flex under torque. These welds? Pretty, but they're not deep enough. And this cab mount, if you hit a hard enough pothole, it might just leave the rest of the truck behind." Wyatt stared at him, fists tightening. He should have told the old man to screw off, should have said he'd take it somewhere else. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled and muttered, "So what should I have done?" Harlan gave him a long look. Then, instead of mocking him, he walked over to a workbench, grabbed a scrap of tubing, and picked up his welder. "Watch." And just like that, everything changed. Chapter 2. Lessons in Steel. The shop was quiet except for the hum of the welder. Harlan moved with the steady confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. He lined up the tubing, set the torch to the perfect angle, and let the arc do its work. Wyatt watched, arms still crossed, but his eyes betrayed him. He was paying attention. "You see that?" Harlan asked without looking up. Wyatt didn't answer at first. He didn't want to give the old man the satisfaction. But curiosity got the better of him. "What, the way you're stacking the welds?" Harlan gave a slight nod. "Yeah. But more than that, it ain't just about laying beads. It's about penetration, strength. You ever see a weld that looks real pretty but cracks under stress?" "Yeah," Wyatt admitted. "I've had a few do that." "That's 'cause you were welding for looks, not structure. You gotta read the metal, let it tell you what it needs. Too much heat, you weaken it. Too little, it won't hold." "Watch again." Wyatt watched, and this time he noticed the small details. The way Harlan's movements were smooth and deliberate, the way he listened to the sizzle of the arc, adjusting his speed like a musician keeping time. When Harlan finished, he flipped up his hood and knocked on the weld with a gloved hand. "Now, that's gonna hold." Wyatt stepped closer, inspecting it. He ran his fingers over the bead. It wasn't just clean, it was solid, functional. "All right," Wyatt muttered. "I see the difference," Harlan smirked. "Good. Now, you want to learn, or you just here to let me fix your mess?" Wyatt hesitated. He wasn't sure what it was, the way Harlan talked, the way he worked, but something about it made him want to stay. "Yeah," he said finally. "I want to learn." Harlan tossed him a pair of gloves. "Then grab the torch. Let's see what you can do." He still didn't take everything Harlan said as gospel. He had his own ideas, his own style. But more and more he found himself applying Harlan's lessons in his own work. His welds got stronger, his measurements more precise, and his designs, they started to have more than just flair. They had structure. One afternoon, as they were wrapping up, Wyatt watched Harlan run his hands over a finished frame rail, checking the welds by feel. There was something methodical about it, something almost reverent. "You love this stuff, huh?" Wyatt asked. Harlan grinned, but there was something tired in his eyes. Son, you spend long enough doing something, it either breaks you or becomes part of you. This is part of me. Wyatt nodded. He didn't say it, but he was starting to feel it too. Chapter 4. Life, Work, and the Call of Paint. Wyatt never thought he'd trade the smell of hot metal for the hum of factory work, but life had a way of making decisions for you. The union job came with stability, good pay, benefits, and a schedule that let him be home in time for dinner. That mattered now. He wasn't just some kid in a garage chasing a dream. He was a husband, and soon enough a father. Harlan knew before Wyatt even told him. "Let me guess," the old man said one evening when Wyatt stopped by the shop. "You got yourself a real job." Wyatt shrugged. "Union gig, steady work." Harlan nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Ain't nothing wrong with that. You do what you gotta do." Wyatt expected sarcasm, maybe some speech about how factory welding was killing his creativity, but Harlan just handed him a beer and leaned against the workbench. "Still gonna build on the side?" "Yeah," Wyatt said. "Can't let it go completely." "Good." And that was that. Chapter 5. The Return to the Shop. Wyatt's life shifted fast. Marriage, a baby girl, mortgage payments. The late nights in his own shop became fewer, the projects slower. But every now and then, when time allowed, he found himself back at Harlan's. Not for welding, for paint. Harlan had always been known for his fabrication skills, but Wyatt started to notice something else. The way he handled a paint gun, the way he mixed colors like an artist, layering depth and reflection onto every car that rolled into his shop. One evening, as Wyatt helped mask off a '69 Camaro, he finally asked, "How'd you learn to paint like this?" Harlan smirked. "Trial, error, and a whole lot of bad jobs before I got good." Wyatt watched him lay down a coat of candy apple red, the metal shimmering like liquid. He'd always thought of paint as just the finishing touch, but now, seeing it up close, he realized it was just as much an art as the build itself. "I want to learn," Wyatt said without thinking. Harlan didn't look surprised. He just nodded. "Then grab a gun. Let's see what you can do." Chapter 6. A Life in Paint and Metal. Wyatt had been learning to weld and fabricate for years, but painting was a different beast. It required patience, control, and an eye for detail he hadn't quite developed yet. His first attempt was rough. The paint gun sputtered, and instead of a smooth, even coat, the panel looked like it had been rained on. Harlan chuckled. "Looks like a Dalmatian." Wyatt sighed. "It's harder than it looks." "Everything worth doing is," Harlan said, grabbing the gun from Wyatt's hand. "Let me show you something." Wyatt watched as Harlan moved with effortless precision, misting a perfect coat over the panel. "You make it look easy," Wyatt muttered. Harlan smiled, but there was something distant in his expression. "That's 'cause I've been doing this longer than you've been alive." Wyatt glanced at him. "How'd you start?" Harlan hesitated, then set the paint gun down. "Lost my dad when I was 12. Was just me and my mom after that. We got by, but it wasn't easy." Wyatt hadn't expected that. Harlan never talked about himself much. "My next-door neighbor ran a body shop," Harlan continued. "I'd hang around after school, sweeping floors, taking out the trash, whatever he needed. One day he let me sand a panel. The next I was taping off trim. By the time I was 14, I painted my first hot rod." Wyatt raised an eyebrow. 14? Harlan smirked. "Didn't say it was good, but I never stopped." He leaned back, staring at the half-finished car in front of them. "I learned metalwork the same way. Spent my teens soaking up knowledge from anybody who'd talk to me. Shop techs, my boss's old buddies, even the paint suppliers. Figured if I kept my mouth shut and my ears open, I'd learn something useful." Wyatt nodded. He understood that. He'd done the same thing with Harlan. Harlan patted the panel. "Now, you ready to stop making excuses and learn how to do this right?" Wyatt grinned. "Yeah, show me." Chapter 7. The Student's Progress. As the weeks went on, Wyatt's skills began to sharpen, and the mistakes became fewer. He still couldn't get the smooth finish that Harlan could, but he was getting closer. He studied every move the old man made, paying attention to the way Harlan prepped, mixed, and applied the paint with almost a painter's grace. Every action was deliberate, yet fluid. It wasn't just the paint, though. Wyatt could see how Harlan's entire approach to work had shaped his life. It wasn't just about the job. It was a passion that ran through everything he did. From the meticulous care he took in sanding a panel, to the hours spent mixing custom colors to match a vintage Corvette's original shade, Harlan's precision and dedication were evident in every corner of the shop. Wyatt found himself staying later and later at the shop, even when there was no work to be done. He'd sit in the corner, watching Harlan work, asking questions, soaking in whatever advice he could. It felt less like a job now and more like a calling. One evening, as Harlan cleaned his brushes, Wyatt looked at him, unsure of how to phrase the question that had been on his mind. "You ever think about teaching again?" Wyatt asked. Harlan glanced up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Teaching? In what, a classroom?" "Nah, like you used to. I mean, you've got a lot of knowledge. There's got to be a way to pass it down." Harlan shrugged. "I passed down what I could. My way of teaching is more hands-on than lecturing." Wyatt smiled. "I'm starting to get that." "Well, maybe I'm starting to get something too," Harlan said with a grin. "You've got more than just metalwork in your veins. You got the painting bug too. The way you've been paying attention, I can see it." Wyatt felt a sense of pride, though he wasn't sure if it was the paint job or something deeper that Harlan was acknowledging. Chapter 8. A Bond Strengthened. It had been a few months since Wyatt had started painting under Harlan's guidance, and a few things had changed in his life. He and his wife, Jessica, had moved into a new house with a small but growing family. He still worked the union job to support them, but now there was a new space, his dream shop, where he could practice, work on his own builds, and explore the art of painting. But as busy as his life had become, Wyatt always found time to return to Harlan's shop. One evening, after finishing a complicated fender, Wyatt sat with Harlan as the older man cleaned his tools. They were quiet for a while, the sound of the rag against metal the only noise in the room. "You ever think about hanging it up?" Wyatt asked, surprising himself. Harlan paused, then glanced at him. "Hanging it up? You know, retiring, or slowing down." Harlan chuckled softly. "Son, I've been slowing down for years, but the truth is, you don't retire from this life. It's in your blood. Even when you can't bend over a frame like you used to, you still find ways to make it work. I'll keep working till I can't anymore." Wyatt nodded, the weight of Harlan's words settling in. There was a truth to them, a realization that the things they loved, the things they built with their hands, were more than just work. They were a part of who they were. "So," Wyatt began, "what's next?" Harlan raised an eyebrow. "For you or for me?" Wyatt smiled. "Both." Harlan leaned back and crossed his arms. "For you, I think it's time to start mixing your own colors. You've got the skills now, but you got to start bringing yourself into your work. And as for me..." He paused, looking out at the shop, the place that had been his life for decades. "I think I've got a few more cars left in me." Wyatt grinned. "Yeah, I bet you do." Harlan smirked. "And don't forget, kid, I'm still learning from you too." Wyatt's heart warmed at that. He'd always thought of himself as the student, but somewhere along the way, things had shifted. They were both teachers now. Chapter 9. A Place to Call Home. Harlan had never been a man to dwell on hardship, but life had a way of testing even the toughest souls. The first stroke came as a cruel surprise. It robbed him of his strength, left his right hand trembling, and made even the simplest tasks exhausting. But what hurt more was what followed. His wife, his partner of so many years, had seen the writing on the wall. She didn't sign up for this life, and she didn't intend to stay for it. She packed up and left, and just like that, Harlan was alone. He recovered as best he could, pushing himself to regain mobility, to keep working, to hold on to his shop. But the truth was, the struggle was mounting. He had moved into a small apartment, downsizing to what he could afford on his dwindling means. The rent was higher than he liked, stretching his limited finances thin. One night, sitting in the dim glow of his apartment's kitchen, Harlan poured Wyatt a drink and leaned back with a tired sigh. "You ever hear about tax sales?" he asked, swirling the liquid in his glass. Wyatt shook his head. "Not really." Harlan smirked. "Figures. Most folks don't pay attention. But I've been watching them for years. County auctions off properties where the owners didn't pay their taxes. If you know what you're looking for, you can get a place for next to nothing. Course, there's risks, but smart money knows how to play it." Wyatt leaned in, intrigued. Harlan might not have been rich, but the man was sharp. If he thought there was something worth looking into, it probably was. A few weeks later, Harlan took Wyatt to one of those auctions. The room was filled with seasoned bidders, real estate investors, and a handful of hopeful first-timers. Harlan pointed out the angles, explaining how to read between the lines of the listing sheets, how to gauge the risk on each property. Then, a house caught Wyatt's eye. A modest place, not too far from his own home. It was in better shape than most on the list, and the opening bid was low. He took a chance, raised his number, and before he knew it, the property was his. "Not bad, kid," Harlan said as they walked out. "You just made your first real investment." But Wyatt hadn't bought the place just for himself. He had bought it with Harlan in mind. Harlan's apartment rent was bleeding him dry, and with his health uncertain, he needed stability. Wyatt knew that no matter how proud Harlan was, he wouldn't accept charity. But he would accept a fair deal. When Wyatt made the offer, he phrased it carefully. "I need a reliable tenant, someone who'll take care of the place, someone I know. You up for it?" Harlan eyed him for a long moment, reading between the lines. He saw the unspoken gesture, the respect behind it. Wyatt wasn't offering a handout. He was offering security. And for once, Harlan let himself take it. "Yeah," he said finally, "I think I am." He moved in a few weeks later, settling into the small but comfortable house just a few streets over from Wyatt's home and shop. He had a place to call his own, a roof over his head that didn't feel like a burden. And more than that, he had a sense of peace, knowing that in all the years he had spent teaching, guiding, and looking out for Wyatt, the kid had been paying attention. Most evenings, Harlan still made his way over to Wyatt's shop, though his hands weren't as steady and his work wasn't as fast. He sat in his usual corner, watching, advising, and occasionally tossing out a sarcastic remark when Wyatt overcomplicated something. The young man had learned well, but Harlan still had plenty of wisdom left to give. Wyatt's daughter had taken to him, often climbing onto his lap with a picture book, asking him to read. And though Harlan had never had children of his own, he found comfort in the warmth of Wyatt's growing family. The second stroke would come later, forcing Harlan into full retirement. But by then, he was already where he needed to be, close to the people who mattered, with a home that was his, in a life where he was still valued. And for a man who had spent his life chasing perfection in metal and paint, that was the best finish he could have asked for. Chapter 10. The Boy, the Butterfly, and the Magical Grove. Harlan had spent his entire life working with his hands, shaping metal, laying down flawless coats of paint, and teaching others how to see perfection before it even existed. But as the years passed and his hands grew slower, the need to create never left him. The fire to share what he had learned, to pass something down, still burned just as bright. One quiet evening, as he sat on the porch of the house Wyatt had made sure he had, Harlan found himself lost in thought. The hum of cicadas filled the air, the scent of summer drifting in on the breeze. He wasn't thinking about cars for once. Instead, his mind drifted to the summers of his childhood, spent at his grandmother's house, a small, simple place nestled near a pond, surrounded by trees that seemed to stretch to the heavens. His grandmother, his father's mother, had been an elementary school teacher. She had a voice that carried wisdom in the gentlest way, and she had a book for every occasion. Most of all, she had Aesop's fables. She read them to him beneath the shade of a willow tree, just before the sun dipped below the water's edge. He could still hear her voice, clear as day. "Every story has a lesson, Harlan. Sometimes we don't see it right away, but if we listen close enough, the lesson will always find us." He had spent those summers fishing her pond, chasing butterflies, running barefoot through the tall grass without a care in the world. Back then, everything felt magical, the rippling water, the whispering trees, even the smallest creatures hiding in the leaves. As a child, he imagined whole worlds existed beyond what his eyes could see. He had believed in the impossible. Now, as an old man, he realized he had spent a lifetime crafting perfection from raw materials, first with cars, then with young minds like Wyatt's. But there was something else, something more intangible, that he had yet to create. On a whim, he picked up a notebook and began to write. At first, it was just memories. The way the pond shimmered in the morning light, how the butterflies danced in the air like tiny spirits. But as he wrote, something happened. His memories took on a life of their own. He imagined himself as a young boy again, following a butterfly deep into the trees, discovering a secret grove where the world wasn't quite what it seemed. The boy in his story could talk to the creatures. He could hear the whispers of the trees. And in this magical grove, every living thing had a lesson to teach. What started as scattered notes became a story. And before Harlan realized it, he had written an entire children's book, The Boy, the Butterfly, and the Magical Grove. It wasn't just a story. It was a reflection of everything he had ever learned. The patience of a fisherman, the careful hand of a painter, the dedication of a craftsman, and most of all, the lessons his grandmother had instilled in him through those old fables. For the first time in years, Harlan felt something stir in his chest, an excitement he hadn't known since he first picked up a paint gun as a teenager. Maybe his days of shaping metal were behind him. But stories? Stories could last forever. And so, a new chapter of his journey began. He didn't stop with just one story. He started writing fables of his own, crafting modern lessons for a new generation, lessons about patience, humility, wisdom, and the pursuit of mastery. His hands might not have been as steady as they once were, but his mind was as sharp as ever. Wyatt's children were his first audience. They would sit by his side, listening intently as he read his latest fable aloud, their wide eyes filled with the same wonder he once had as a child. For the first time in a long while, Harlan saw himself in them. He may have never had children of his own, but he had found his legacy. Not in metal, not in paint, but in the stories that would live on long after he was gone. And with that, he knew his journey was far from over.